Dashidile, welcome to Tibet this week. Today's headlines. His Holiness the Dalai Lama condemns violence in the name of religion. His Holiness the Dalai Lama sends congratulatory message to the new Prime Minister of Malaysia. Permanent Strategy Committee holds third meeting. Sikyong attends Tibet dialogue at Himachal University. Tibetan parliamentarians gather for a strategic meeting. Representative ThinlayChukki highlights journey of Tibetans into exile and democracy during a conference in Milan. Representative NgodupDorjee briefs activists on Tibet's environment. The United States Congressional-Executive Commission on China re-emphasizes on establishment of dialogue between the Chinese government and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. The 11th Tibet Lobby Day underway in Australia. His Holiness the Dalai Lama emphasized on the significance of unity among all religious traditions and respect for other religions in today's time when there is a great division based upon political ideas as well as religious beliefs that are consequently turning violent and creating unrest in the society.
Tangi Chedia Jindri, Turkey's Yondegi Yari. Pena Afghanistan are all Chulu, Tangi Chedia. That day, a Lopambu Shuji Resha. As a Chulu Sama law, any third room and dry yard, the Yene, Miller Pension chair, or Chili, Piki Shamdi Tuya Singeti, Chulu Sama Sukudua.
Since the teaching this time has been requested by the Korean devotees, His Holiness sent his special prayers for the loss of lives in a crowd crush occurred during Halloween festivities in Seoul last month. His Holiness also said he continues to pray for peace and reconciliation between the South and North Korea.
South Korea Yanjik does Miss Hunger of Shush Jevche, the Negi, Mikoshe, Chicken, Dadron Shibesoro, Kada, Shime Shumbesoro, the Shigdua. The top George, any? Ganazu Samalogi, the Regata, Dadron Shimbus, Namizolia, Samsuchia, Samtichia, Dasun Samalolia, Mazumalam Jaya, Kashamuri. Any remake Korea Chama on the doors not of South University. North Korea. The Karelia, the Ko Singruja to Yachigi, any Malam Jagi, any Monata, any Asia LinkedIn DD, Monata Negata, say Kashinimiki. Shidi Tanto Yang Shidi Ayadi, Samki Shidi Tone, any Shidi Ayajigi, Oda, name Malam Joe, and Samalogi, Tomo Nashoa, and a Tristele to share.
His Holiness began a two-day teaching this morning on Nagarjuna's The Fundamental Wisdom on the Middle Way, Umatsawa Sherab. The teaching is taking place at the main temple, Tsuklakhang Dharamshala, at the request of the Korean devotees. His Holiness the Dalai Lama has written to Anwar Ibrahim to congratulate him on becoming the Prime Minister of Malaysia. His Holiness in his letter recalled his visit to Malaysia back in 1982 and his meeting with the late Prime Minister Tunku Abdul Rahman and other leaders of the country. His Holiness wished the new Prime Minister every success in meeting the challenges that lie ahead in fulfilling the hopes and aspirations of the people of Malaysia. The Permanent Strategy Committee of the 16th Kashak commenced its third meeting today here in Dharamshala. The three-day meeting is being chaired by Sikyong Pemba Siring and attended by the members of the committee. During this 3-day meeting, the committee will review and discuss progress of the ongoing strategic programs and deliberate on future advocacy initiatives as per the objectives of the committee. Sikyong Pembatsiring and the former Kallön Triba Professor Samdong Rinpoche attended the Tibet dialogue that was held concurrently with the ceremony conferring Swami Satyananda Stokes Samman upon Professor Kuldeep Chand Agnihotri. The event took place at the Central University of Himachal Pradesh in Dharamshala yesterday. Sikyong Pembatsiring also interacted with nuns from Pakhang Thundrupding Monastery in Nepal at Kashak Secretariat in Kangchen Kishong on Tuesday this week. Sikyong emphasized the role of exiled Tibetans as a representatives and spokesperson of Tibetans inside Tibet during his address to a group of about 50 nuns. Sikyong briefed the nuns on the present situation of Tibetans in Tibet and recommended them to read as much as possible on Tibet's history. This Tuesday, the Tibetan parliamentarians gathered for a brainstorming and strategic meeting. Speaker of the Tibetan Parliament in Exile, Khenpo Sonam Tempel, said the meeting focuses on discussing current situation inside Tibet, including its critical environmental and human rights situation, and in learning in depth the structural formation of People's Republic of China. The sessions of the meeting featured speakers such as Professor Chamba Samden from Central University for Tibetan Studies, Varanasi, and research fellows from the Tibet Policy Institute, Dr. Tenzin Suljim, Dejen Palmo, and Tsiring Samdrup. Representative ThinlayChukki of the Tibet Bureau in Geneva highlighted the journey of Tibetans into exile and the milestone democratization of the exiled Tibetan community under the visionary leadership of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in a 2-day conference titled Forever Tibet in Milan, Italy. The conference featured distinguished speakers including Kasu Chezun Pema, who shared the earlier account of exile's journey in looking after the welfare of Tibetan children and her observation of the situation inside Tibet during her visit to Tibet as a part of the fact-finding delegation to Tibet in the 1980s. Speaking at the conference for a session titled The Political Question, along with the former envoy of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the advisor of Central Tibetan Administration's Permanent Strategy Committee, Kesang Gyaltsen, Representative ThinlayChukki presented the evolution of full-fledged democratic administration of the Tibetan exiled community, resulting from the far-sighted, compassionate leadership of His Holiness. The 2-day conference was organized by the Italian Buddhist Union in cooperation with the Italy-Tibet Association, Gandhi Perdang Foundation of Dalai Lama, and the International Campaign for Tibet and Tibetan Community in Italy. Representative NgodupDorjee of Office of Tibet South Africa gave a talk and a presentation on environmental situation in Tibet at a conference last Sunday. The talk was attended by more than 50 representatives and environmental activists from 17 Durban-based civil societies such as Climate Justice Charter Movement, Greenpeace Durban Local Group, Zero Waste Durban, Cultures of Resistance, and Interfaith Youth Climate Forum. The Office of Tibet South Africa has reported members of audience expressing having learned many new insights about the climate change taking place in Tibet and its far-reaching implication to billions of people being sustained by its waters. The Congressional-Executive Commission on China released its annual report on 16 November 2022. The annual report presented recommendations to re-establish genuine dialogue between the Chinese government and His Holiness the Dalai Lama based on the rights of the Tibetans under international law to self-determination and demanded the release of Tibetan political prisoners who are being held or imprisoned for peacefully exercising their human rights, including a request to invite the United States ambassador to China and representatives of international organizations to meet with the 11th Panchen Lama Gyaltsen Chögyal Nyima. The Congressional-Executive Commission on China also called for visits by UN experts and UN special procedure personnel to Tibet and assess the situation in colonial boarding schools in Tibet. This year's report once again documented centralized political control in China, egregious abuse of human rights, brutal censorship, torture and detention of activists for human rights, continuing genocides, accelerating sinicization, and harsh measures enforcing the zero-COVID policy, enforcing draconian and unsustainable policies in China, Tibet, East Turkestan, Hong Kong, and Macau. The 11th round of Tibet Lobby Day, organised by Australia-Tibet Council, held this Monday, called on the Australian government to put forward a policy to protect the succession of the 14th Dalai Lama without any interference from the Chinese government. A delegation of 15 young Tibetans across Australia met with close to 30 Australian Member of Parliaments and senators from all parties. Over 1,000 Australians have signed a pledge to only recognize a Dalai Lama appointed via Tibetan Buddhist traditions and practices without interference by the Chinese government. At the Australian Senate, Senator Janet Rice of the Greens pointed out the concerns regarding the succession of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and of the missing 11th Panchen Lama of Tibet that was highlighted to her by the Tibetan delegation.
The delegates who are seated in the gallery today, including Mr Tenzin Phuntsok Doring, the member of the Tibetan Parliament in Exile for the electorate of Australasia, and Mr Karma Singay, representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Australia. I had the privilege of travelling with Mr Singay to Washington DC in June this year for the 8th World Parliamentarians Convention on Tibet. And one of the issues that the Tibetan delegation are raising with members of parliament, which I spoke to them about this morning, is the succession of the Dalai Lama. In 1995, Chinese security forces kidnapped a year-old Tibetan child, NgodupDorjee Nyima, following his recognition by the Dalai Lama as the Tibet's Panchen Lama. And tragically, he hasn't been heard from since. Today, he would be over 30 years old. Tibet's traditional practices, culture and Tibetan Buddhism are under threat. Carrying or possessing a photo of the Dalai Lama brings with it harsh penalties, including imprisonment. The Greens believe that universal human rights are fundamental and must be respected and protected for all peoples in all countries, and that applies here in Australia as well. And we will speak out about human rights abuses wherever they occur. We urge the Australian government to oppose any effort to interfere with the practices of Tibetan Buddhism and only recognise a Dalai Lama appointed via Tibetan Buddhist traditions and practices. And I have lodged a motion to this effect on the notice paper today, and it is something that I will continue to raise in this place through every means possible.
Tibet Lobby Day is an annual event organised by the Australia-Tibet Council in collaboration with Tibetan community associations, where Tibetans and Tibet supporters come together to meet with Australian parliamentarians to talk about different issues concerning Tibet. That is all for this week's News on Tibet. See you next week.